Hello, everyone in Argentina. It's a pleasure to speak to you today, although I would very much prefer if I could come to your meeting in Rosario, but we have to do it in a virtual way. I would like to talk to you in pretty general terms about a new paradigm for plant nutrition, which we call responsible plant nutrition. It's the result of a thought process that has been going on also in the industry, the fertilizer industry that I now represent for the last few years. And I think it also reflects a lot of the societal developments that have happened over the last 25, 30 years, and that in many ways now have impact on agriculture. So what it basically means is that in everything we do, we need to have more of a systems view, more of a holistic view that goes beyond the traditional picture of agriculture that many of us have in mind and have worked in during their long careers. I will start by showing what we normally now call, or often call, the old paradigm. And I think it's very much reflected in this graph, which shows the yield of winter wheat grown in the broad bark long-term experiment at Rothamsted in the UK. It's the oldest long-term experiment in the world. It started in 1843, and what you see here are 5-year averages of yields of wheat in different treatments, and you can see the blue line at the bottom, if we do not apply any fertilizer or manure, the yield of wheat is about 1 to 2 tons, and it hasn't changed over the last 175 years, irrespective of changes in the crop varieties, which you see at the bottom here. Capel is the first high-yielding short straw variety that came in 1966. But it was also shown very quickly, already 175 years ago, that if you applied a large amount of manure, that pink line here, or a full dose of NPK and other nutrients as mineral fertilizers, you could double or triple the yields. And that was pretty much the main intervention for about 100 years. And then a succession of other technology changes came in place, the high-yielding varieties, herbicides, changes in fertilizer rates, because crops were responsive to it, also changes in nitrogen forms, crop rotations, and so on. So lots of things happened, which we generally describe as intensification of agricultural systems. And you could see that in the monoculture treatment, continuously growing wheat, we were able to get very quickly yields of about 6 tons. And if wheat was grown in rotation and the first crop after following another crop, then you could get another 2 or 3 tons. And nowadays, with very precise management and really excellent varieties, we routinely in this experiment harvest wheat yields of 10 to 12 tons under rain-fed conditions. So this is what has happened in one form or another in many parts of the world, and it became widely known as the Green Revolution. I was 16 years old when I joined this Green Revolution in 1977. I grew up in East Germany, the former East Germany, and that was the period when industrial scale intensification of agriculture was being popularized. You can see on these pictures machines. These are all machines that I actually learned how to drive, how to operate. So because I started a 3-year apprenticeship as an agricultural chemist or agrochemist. I'm not even sure whether that profession still exists nowadays. But it was a time when fertilizers, pesticides, and other agrochemicals were seen as a major ingredient for successful, high-yielding modern agriculture. And you can see that fertilizer spreaders, like in this picture, even made it onto the postage stamps in my country. So we were young. We were excited about this technology, about the ability to do agriculture on a large scale in big fields with big machinery. And in many parts of the world, that trend has continued since then. What we probably didn't know or didn't pay enough attention to were the consequences of some of this work that we now see at a global scale in various forms. So we now, of course, are aware of many of the environmental implications that this type of intensive agriculture has. But what's probably even worse is that we have what we may call a global imbalance of many nutrients, and nitrogen in particular. You see here a world map on which a simple nitrogen input-output budget was calculated, and the difference then is the nitrogen surplus or deficit. And you can see very clearly that we have on one side regions in the world like North America, parts of Europe, India and China, where we have created a fairly large surplus of nitrogen when you calculate all inputs and outputs together. But we also have other parts in the world, and most strikingly, pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Eastern Europe and Russia, former Soviet Union countries, where we actually have a very low nitrogen surplus or even a deficit. And you would get a similar picture for other nutrients like phosphorus or potassium. So the point is that we have excess of nutrients in some parts of the world, but we have lack of nutrients and mining soils in other parts of the world. And that's the global imbalance that has many consequences for food security, but also on the environmental side. And it's one of the big challenges that needs to be overcome. And there's an urgency to correct this now. We cannot just continue the developments of the past, because then obviously that imbalance would even become worse. So how do we go about this? And this was the background to a document written by the new scientific panel on responsible plant nutrition on this new paradigm for plant nutrition. You can get access to this paper now also in a Spanish translation at the website of the scientific panel. We were trying to identify what is the problem, what are the key issues, and what we can do about who needs to do what, and what would success in the end look like if we are making some substantial changes in the next 10 or 20 years. How could we then contribute through a better world in that manner? So I'm just starting with highlighting some of the identified problems or issues that are part of this new paradigm and need to be tackled. So this is the first one, and it essentially means that in the future we need to find a way that we decouple future growth in food production, which is still needed as long as the world population grows, from the growth rates of fertilizer consumption on a global average scale. So you can see on this graph here, the brown dots are crop nitrogen removal, global total. So that's a proxy for yield or crop production as a total. And on the orange line here, you see fertilizer nitrogen input. And what you can see is that fertilizer nitrogen input on an average base for the globe as a whole, for the world as a whole, has risen faster than the growth in crop production, and therefore we have generated a growing surplus of nitrogen, 60 to 70 million tons each year, in excess of what we are removing with the crop. And that, of course, has all kind of environmental implications. So we need to find a way to break that relationship, and achieve future growth with less growth in nitrogen fertilizer consumption, or even at some stage then flattening out. And that means massive increases on a global scale of nitrogen use efficiency, and you could extrapolate that view to other nutrients, particularly also phosphorus. A second big problem that we have already alluded to, we need to find a way to overcome the widespread nutrient deficiency in Africa, because that is the continent with the biggest food security and malnutrition problems in the world. We've made some progress in the last 20 years, or 15 years even, the average application amount of fertilizers, and that is nitrogen, phosphate, and potash together, in sub-Saharan Africa rose from about 10 kg per hectare to 20, not excluding South Africa, which is a little higher. But that is still a tiny amount, and probably only 10% or less of what is typically applied in farms of the Americas and Europe or other parts of the world. And there are only 4 or 5 countries in Africa where that rate is 50 kg or more. So that is a massive challenge, and we need to find a solution to this in the next 10 to 20 years, because without fertilizers, without nutrients, Africa will not be able to feed itself more. In the paper, we identified a whole range of other big issues. I'm not having enough time to go through those now, but we'll come back to some of those when we talk about some of the proposed actions. But you can see, based on this list here, that in principle, our aim is in this new paradigm for plant nutrition to have a more holistic view, a food systems view in terms of how we manage nutrients, and also a circular economy approach that ensures that we close nutrient cycles, that we improve the recovery of nutrients from different waste streams, and where it is possible, also reintegrate crop and livestock production. And all of that together would enable us to have a much higher level of nutrient use efficiency at the scale of an entire food system, not just at the scale of a farm, which most of us are most familiar with, or a field even. So we need to think food systems and sustainability of the food chain as a whole. Now, this is not an entirely new thought. The industry itself, the fertilizer industry, also already had discussions several years ago. And in November 2019, we had a high-level forum in which we agreed on a document that already spelled out more of an industry vision for a new paradigm for sustainable plant nutrition, which still acknowledges that food security is very important, but one must also embrace the other dimensions of sustainability, particularly when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, carbon sequestration, pollution and biodiversity, water and nutrient recycling, waste and nutrient recycling, and human nutrition and health. These are all new targets for how we manage nutrients in crop production. So it's not just crop yield and maybe a little bit of crop quality. It is much more than that. And some leading companies are already developing business solutions to that. So the understanding is now very clear that sustainability is not just a bit of corporate social responsibility anymore, or a scientific concept. It's actually becoming a business necessity and also a business opportunity. I'm just showing one example here. I'm not trying to promote any particular company, but if you look at Yara as this example, it's essentially moving from a company that used to produce fertilizer products to now becoming a more sophisticated provider of food solutions and ultimately also climate neutral solutions. And of course, also providing opportunities for clients, in this case farmers, to be part of that, and also part of new payment schemes that come along with this. So this is the future, and industry is embracing this. In scientific terms, in the scientific panel, we defined the new paradigm as essentially a concept that integrates scientific and engineering know-how, agronomic practices, business models, and policies that directly or indirectly affect the production, utilization, and recycling of mineral nutrients in agri-food systems. And it then, of course, results in specific, more integrated, more holistic plant nutrition solutions that try to achieve this. So we have 5 overarching objectives or aims of this new paradigm, which you can see on the left here. So productivity, efficiency, and resilience sit, of course, at the middle, but it's interfaced, interacting with the other objectives: emissions and environment, nutrition and health, soil health, and waste and recycling. And we identified 6 key actions, which I will now speak about, that we think are essential to achieve this new paradigm. One important point that we would like to make is that this is the global picture. This is the general framework, but the actual roadmaps, the actual targets, the actual solutions differ, of course, because every country in the world, every business, every farm already starts at a different level. So we need to then also enable everyone to define their own solutions based on a clear set of targets, to think more in this holistic manner. So it's not a recipe that applies to everyone in the same way, because the starting points are different and the goals are different. But if everyone can at least keep these elements in mind, then we will achieve the global targets together. So the first action is on sustainability-driven nutrient policies and business models that must be therefore tailored to the specific food systems and other situations in a country, because the priorities for managing nutrients will differ. And one can illustrate this here based on this graph, which shows on the left side a typical calculation of crop nitrogen or nutrient use efficiency as a function of output over nutrient inputs. And on the x-axis, we have here a typical historical or time progression, which in a country happens in the form of economic development and therefore also crop yield increases. And we typically see 3 situations. So at the beginning of a historical period, fertilizer use and other nutrient input use is relatively low, crop yields are low. We have often nutrient outputs exceeding inputs. And so the apparent nutrient use efficiency, this blue line, seems very high, but that in fact represents a situation of nutrient mining. So sub-Saharan Africa, most of it is still at this stage. But in that situation, of course, we also have no or very little nutrient surplus, but we have maybe a mining beginning. As countries then develop and intensify their production, fertilizer use rises. And then, of course, as a result of this, the efficiency goes down and the surplus of nitrogen or other nutrients goes up. And that has happened in many countries. So you can see India, for example, is at a point where it is now very low in nitrogen use efficiency, has pretty high surpluses. China in the last 5-6 years has actually come back from its low and is now starting to increase nitrogen use efficiency through the use of better recommendations and better technologies, but also government restrictions on nitrogen use. And so it's starting to build a lower surplus. And in the third stage, we have then, of course, technology and policies further enhancing innovation and adoption of nutrient efficiency, good technologies. And we are at that stage for most parts of Western Europe and North America. So you then move towards maximizing nutrient efficiency close to what is possible, and you minimize excess levels of nutrients. So that's the overall pathway. And of course, it's different in country to country. One needs to have very good indicators for this. This simple input-output calculation for nitrogen use efficiency works very well. In the European expert panel for nitrogen, we developed this indicator in this form. So you calculate it based as the inputs from fertilizer, from manure, from biological nitrogen fixation, whatever goes in, roughly speaking, and the outputs from the harvest. And then you can plot this efficiency indicator against the fertilizer application rate. and you can define ranges of optimal nutrient or nitrogen use efficiency you would like to be in that also ensure that you have very high yields. So this white part here in this graph would represent that range where you would like to achieve, where you would be able to achieve high levels of productivity with a high level of nitrogen use efficiency. In that case, typically being between over 70 and up to 90% of efficiency. So that would ensure that you do not mine the soil, that you make good profits, and that you do good things for the environment. So you can use this type of graphical display to track the progress in your own farm or in your business or in a country by calculating nitrogen input-output budgets. Now in Argentina, of course, you know very well that typically, and of course, it all depends on how you calculate these budgets, but in a broader sense, I think it is correct to say that historically and still today, for the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in Argentina, you're exporting more nutrients from most fields than you're adding. That balance difference is most pronounced for potassium, the blue line. So your efficiencies, if you calculate them as input over output, seem very high, but this anything above 1 represents mining situations. So the question for Argentina, I guess, is how long can one do this? What is the roadmap in Argentina to achieve a more sustainable use of nutrients that ensures that we're not running out the soils over the longer term? The second action that we propose is that we really need to now do better in terms of not just developing more knowledge-intensive solutions for fertilizer decision-making, recommendations, decision tools, but also bringing them to millions of farmers. This may be less of a challenge in this situation on the right. These are rice fields in Uruguay, so very large rice fields, few farmers. It's easy to have professional support and good recommendations for a few of these farmers, but the big problem in the world are the hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers that operate on small parcels of land like this, and also have very big differences between these little fields in terms of nutrient needs. So how to achieve this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. There's been a lot of work in the past to develop wonderful site-specific nutrient management applications that have a very strong scientific concept. There was a lot of my work in the 1990s about this, and rice, later also in maize and wheat, and now this has been expanded in up to 20 different crops, particularly in China. And we have seen that typically we get 10 to 20% increases in yield. We need 10% less nitrogen fertilizer. We get high increases in nitrogen fertilizer efficiency, less greenhouse gas emissions, often need less pesticide sprays, have generally more balanced nutrient budgets in the soil. And we've developed software tools like Nutrient Expert by the former IPNI or IRIS in the Philippines, family of crop manager apps for rice and other crops. So all wonderful work, and we've been able to sort of reach thousands of farmers, but how are we going to bring this to millions of farmers? And that's where maybe in the future, besides humans, which will always be needed, technology can help. So we have, of course, high hopes that with the advances in data science, machine learning, and other forms of artificial intelligence, maybe now is the time that fertilizer recommendations and decision tools can become actually self-learning applications that draw on the big amounts of data that are now being collected or can be collected from many farms, and automatically update these and regularly fine-tune these recommendations to the specific needs of individual fields or even less. What this essentially means is that now we may finally be able to move towards more automated decisions, taking more and more of the human component, which is typically also slow and tedious, out of this process towards more real-time self-learning fertilizer decision systems. That's one hope I have. It's not easy, but I think we should at least try. The third action that we focused much on is the need to have much better integration or reintegration in many cases of crop livestock systems. And this is illustrated in this picture on the right here. There are clearly many opportunities for this, but in an ideal world, we want livestock, particularly cattle and other ruminants, to be fed based on what they're good at, grassland. And we will need to manage this grassland well, and then we can use arable land to produce food crops, primarily for human food consumption and less for livestock feeding, only what is really needed. But we can also then ensure that the byproducts from the food production side, from the animal production side, from the human food chain, any waste that is occurring there, are moving back into the fields, or maybe in between, even through another processing stage to draw out energy or other compounds. So more of these closed loop cycles, I think, are possible now. And there's also a lot of opportunities for new technologies in any of these stages in the process to make sure that nutrients get well recovered and reutilized. There's a wide field of innovation possible already. A fourth action that we identified is on nutrient or nutrition sensitive agriculture. That has many dimensions. Of course, you would like to say that if we have more diverse cropping systems with more nutritious crops and the market for those, and that's good for humans. But there's also lots of opportunities to do improvement in nutrition through fertilizer. This is one example which is probably the best known. In 1985, the government of Finland decided that from now on, all fertilizers in Finland must be enriched with a small amount of selenium, 10 to 15 milligrams of selenium per kilogram fertilizer sold. And that had an immediate impact and still lasting impact on the health of the Finnish population. You can see the selenium content in wheat went up, and there was ups and downs, but it's still higher than it was before. And this is surveys of human health. You can see selenium concentration in the blood plasma of humans has pretty much followed what happened through the enrichment of the wheat crop. So we believe that these types of targeted interventions can help to address many nutritional problems, particularly those associated, for example, with iron, zinc, selenium, and iodine. The fifth action is more on the fertilizer design and production side. So we believe that there's still a lot of potential to design smarter fertilizers through new technologies. And, we see some developments already, such as nano fertilizers, but not only there. And there's a massive potential to decarbonize the production of fertilizer. So to produce greener fertilizers with a much lower carbon footprint, lower greenhouse gas emission footprint. Fertilizer production accounts for about nitrogen production, in particular for 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So anything we can do there is a direct sustainability contribution by the fertilizer industry. That has many technological advances that are being tried already in pilot stages, particularly towards production of green ammonia, in which you use renewable energy sources to produce ammonia, but also ammonia becoming increasingly a significant element of a future new energy sector, including the hydrogen energy sector, because ammonia is a very good storage solution for hydrogen, if you wish. And we can imagine in the future, for example, transport solutions like ships also running on ammonia as a fuel rather than diesel, which is highly polluting. In the European Union, it is estimated that in Europe, we could perhaps by 2030 already produce 10% of all of the ammonia as this green ammonia if the economic conditions and political support systems are suitable for this. This requires massive investments, not only by the private sector, but also by governments to support the scaling up of these new technologies. And the last action that we highlighted is that we need to really accelerate innovation. This has two major dimensions. One is that the general level of investment by public and private sector in research and development and innovation in the plant nutrition sector is too low. I think it has eroded over decades in many countries, and compared to other agricultural industries, for example, crop breeding or crop protection industries, the investments in R&D have typically been a lot lower. So there's definitely a massive need to increase this. But the other dimension is that we also should think in the scientific world in particular to work differently and embrace more of the lean innovation concepts that are more typical for entrepreneurs, for startup companies. So we take too long often, or never sometimes achieve it, to move from a scientific discovery to a practical application that actually works at a larger scale. Often that never happens. So the innovation approach would focus on a design of a minimum viable product very quickly, building it, and testing particularly the most difficult assumptions quickly, and even failing quickly, learn from that, and then move on to the next cycle. And in every one of these iterative cycles that are shown on this graph here, move already with the right kind of partners to the next scale. This requires more openness in innovation. It requires more collaboration, more sharing of know-how and resources. But it's the only way to really make some of the bigger breakthroughs that will be needed now, more urgently than ever. So it is clear that implementing this kind of new paradigm is a complex task. It's the responsibility of many organizations and stakeholders. So it's not just farmers, which of course are always perhaps one of the most important ones, or the fertilizer industry, but also those involved in the trading and processing of food companies, retailers themselves, and at the end, of course, also consumers. You see red arrows here, which show that at every one of these stages, nutrient losses or leakages occur, and which we also want to capture and move back into the production systems, either at farm or industrial scale level. And of course, we need to have overarching support and really also clear regulations, clear investments, clear frameworks, and also the right kind of scientific approach to enable this. But that's the picture of how this new paradigm should look like and how it could be implemented. So if we were able to do this, then maybe 20 years from now, one human generation from now, we could have achieved some of these items listed here. I mean, the first one is that we would have much higher standards for nutrient use efficiency anywhere in the world, and also the ability to monitor them properly. I think we would have achieved this decoupling of crop production growth from fertilizer growth on a global scale, and crop nitrogen use efficiency should have risen on a global scale to 70%. It is currently about 50% only. I think it should be possible by then to halve the amounts of nutrients that are wasted in one way or another in this food system chain that I've shown. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, fertilizer used by then would have maybe tripled and been the main contributor for doubling or tripling crop yields by then. I think we would like to have the ability to say, by then, all the extreme forms of hunger and malnutrition have been eradicated. The footprint of greenhouse gas emissions of fertilizers has been reduced by at least 30%, maybe even more. Investments in innovation and research have tripled. and consumers finally appreciate what fertilizers do for them, rather than always being critical about these things. And most importantly, farmers would have access, every farmer in the world, to much more tailored, much more sophisticated, much more successful nutrient management solutions. So this is what we are proposing in the scientific panel. We are currently working on 2 other papers. One will deal with the future of 4R nutrient stewardship and how it needs to evolve also in the context of this new paradigm. And the second one will be dealing with the interactions between fertilizers and biodiversity, which is also a very important sustainability dimension. With that, I wish you an excellent conference. And once again, unfortunately, I can't join you today. Thank you very much.